Russian president, in fact, has warned that Russia will consider using cluster munitions against Ukraine if they are used against them. His warnings come as Ukraine announced that it received American-made cluster munitions not too long ago. Now, in an interview with a pro-Kremlin journalist, Putin said that Russia had a sufficient supply of various types of cluster munitions but had not used it. Force our hand and we'll use it is what the Russian president came out and said, a clear-cut warning that was sent to Ukraine to think twice before they use these cluster munitions.
President Vladimir Putin said Sunday that Russia has cluster bombs and will use them if Ukraine uses the weapons against Russian forces first. He told state TV Moscow that the Russian Federation has a, quote, sufficient stockpile of different types of cluster munitions. Putin denied using them, but went on to say, if they are used against us, we reserve the right to take reciprocal action. On Thursday, Ukraine said it had received cluster bombs from the United States, its biggest military backer. The U.S. said the munitions are needed to compensate for shell shortages faced by Kyiv's forces at a time when they are mounting a counteroffensive. Cluster munitions are banned in more than 100 countries, though Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S. have not signed up to the Convention on Cluster Munitions. The weapons typically release large numbers of smaller bomblets that can kill indiscriminately over a wide area. Some of them inevitably fail to explode and can pose a danger for decades, particularly to children. Ukraine has said it will use cluster bombs to dislodge concentrations of enemy soldiers when trying to take back its own territory, but will not use them on Russian territory. Putin said he regarded the use of cluster bombs as a crime. Human Rights Watch says both countries have used cluster munitions.
Fighters from the Wagner Group have arrived in Belarus from Russia. That's according to Ukrainian and Polish officials and comes after the Belarusian Defense Ministry released this video on Friday, showing what it said were Wagner fighters instructing Belarusian soldiers at a military range. It appeared to be a first sign that at least part of a deal to end Wagner's mutiny attempt was being implemented. Wagner's march on Moscow in June could have tipped Russia into civil war, according to President Vladimir Putin. Under the deal, Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin stood down his mercenaries and agreed to move them to Belarus, in exchange for Russia dropping mutiny charges. But until the past few days, there'd been no sign of them going there, and Prigozhin hasn't been seen in public since June 24. On Saturday, a spokesperson for the Ukrainian border agency confirmed Wagner was in Belarus in a statement posted on Telegram. And videos shared by Russian war correspondent Alexander Kots on Saturday evening appeared to show a convoy of trucks and military vehicles on a highway in southern Russia. Some were flying the Wagner flag. There was no immediate comment from the Kremlin. The Belarusian Hayun project, which monitors military activity in the country and is viewed as an extremist formation by Minsk, said a large column of at least 60 vehicles with Donetsk and Luhansk license plates entered Belarus overnight Friday from Russia. President Alexander Lukashenko hasn't sent troops to Ukraine, but he has allowed Moscow to use Belarusian territory to launch its invasion and as a base for Russian nuclear weapons. A Polish deputy minister also said on Twitter that Warsaw had confirmation of several hundred Wagner fighters' presence in Belarus. Poland said this month it was bolstering its border with Belarus to address any potential threats.
Ben Harris continues to be with us, and the kind of commentary that we've seen around the use of cluster ammunitions, where do you think that is going? Because Ukraine has also given in writing that they're not going to be using these munitions in populated areas. But once the use actually happens and when you're in the thick of war, is it actually easy to draw that kind of line?
No, not at all. And there's a lot of problems with these cluster bombs. As your correspondent mentioned, over 100 countries ban them, consider them to be illegal, although Russia, Ukraine, and the US specifically have not signed off on that convention. And it's caused a split within NATO because NATO allies, the Western allies in Europe particularly, are not happy about this at all, in so much as they consider it to be illegal. The Russians have said they haven't used them, they have used them, but in limited amounts in the beginning. I took that to be a gesture by the Russian side to say, look, we have these munitions, we could use them, but they've been restrained. They haven't used them recently, not since last year. However, they're threatening now that if the US deliver these cluster bombs and they're used against the Russians, that they will retaliate in kind. And they're daisy cutters. They kill everything in their vicinity, irrespective of whether it's soldiers or civilians. Moreover, some small percentage, between 1% and 5%, but up to 30%, don't go off. These sub-bomblets, these little, they lie in the grass. And they cause huge problems for years after, with people, children stepping on them and them going off and killing them. At the same time, it's indicative of the fact that basically the West has run out of regular shells, 115 millimeter, which is the workhorse, and the West has not invested any production capacity to make new shells, and they've given their stockpiles to Ukraine, which is running out of them rapidly. And so, to me, this also smacks of desperation, in so much as the counteroffensive is going on. Ukraine desperately needs shells in order to take out heavily defended Russian positions. They don't have the regular 115 millimeter shells, or not enough of them. And so the US, as an interim measure, is giving these cluster bombs, which will be very effective. But like I say, it causes a huge problem of legitimacy, because these things are widely considered to be illegal. And if the Russians come back in kind, then this whole war becomes even more bloody, even more complicated, even cruder than it already is. But to get through the summer, I don't see, if Ukraine needs munitions, shells, and the US and the West don't have any more of the regular ones, then this is what they're reaching to. It all smacks or suggests that the counteroffensive is not going anywhere as well as everyone was hoping it would do.
And that's definitely how Kremlin has been viewing that. Charge, of course, that Ukraine denies the counteroffensive is taking place in a steady pace, is what Ukraine says. But as far as cluster munitions go, it's better for the world if they are not used, if these are just threats that go around and not something that translate into action. But Ben Harris, thank you so much for speaking with us here on News 18 Global and sharing your perspective.